My greetings to everyone. I am Professor Namita Rajput, Department of Commerce, Sri Aurobindo College, University of Delhi. We are on with the corporate governance series, and today we are discussing the important corporate scandals. Now, in this part of my series, I will be discussing the important global corporate scandals. So, as we have discussed in the earlier lecture, what was a Lehman Brothers? How did they started? What was that it led to the corporate fraud and the corporate scandal? So, let us discuss the factors leading to collapse. There was a subprime mortgage exposure. The Lehman Brothers had heavily invested in the mortgage-backed securities, including a subprime mortgage, during the housing boom of the earlier 20s. They also took the leverage and the risk, and the firm had taken on a significant leverage to finance its investments, making it highly vulnerable to fluctuations in the assets and its value and the market conditions. So, there was a huge liquidity crunch owing to decline in the asset prices, housing prices, they also collapsed owing to a liquidity crunch. So, there was a very important role of the Lehman Brothers, and they also attempt to survive. There was a capital infusion. The Lehman Brothers attempted to share up its capital reserves by raising the funds from the investors and selling off the assets. But there was a failed rescue. Despite the efforts to find a buyer or secure a government bailout, the Lehman was unable to find a viable solution to its financial woes. And ultimately, there was a collapse. There was a bankruptcy filing. On the September 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for the Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, then marking the largest bankruptcy filing in US history at the time. There was a market turmoil. The Lehman collapse sent the shock waves through the global financial systems, triggering the panic in the financial markets, and there was definitely about an ongoing credit crunch. Let's see the aftermath of this crisis. There was a financial crisis which deepens. The Lehman bankruptcy intensified the severity of the financial crisis, leading to a widespread bank failures, the stock market declines, and the economic recession. There was a regulatory reform. The collapse of the Lehman Brothers prompted a regulatory reform aimed at enhancing the oversight of the financial industry, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform and the Consumer Protection Act. There was a legacy and an important lesson learned out of this particular case of Lehman Brothers. The Lehman collapse, which highlighted the dangers of the excessive risk-taking leverage and the inadequate risk management practices in the financial sector. Let's see the impact. The aftermath of the Lehman collapse understood the interconnectedness of the global financial markets and the need for a robust regulatory framework to prevent the systematic risk. The collapse of the Lehman Brothers, it remains a stark reminder of the fragility of the financial system and the devastating consequences of the unchecked risk-taking in the pursuit of the short-term profits. The corporate governance failures exhibited by Enron, WorldCom, and the Lehman Brothers, they offer the valuable lessons for the business, regulators, and the stakeholders. So, let's see the important takeaways from this particular case. The first is your transparency and accountability. Enron downfall underscored the importance of transparency in the financial reporting. The companies must provide a very clear, accurate, and a timely information to the investors and the regulators to maintain the trust and the confidence. There are the companies which must provide a clear, accurate, and a timely information to the investors, regulators to maintain the trust and the confidence. The WorldCom scandal highlighted the need of a robust internal control and the independent oversight mechanisms. Effective corporate governance structure. They should include the checks and the balances to prevent a fraud and the misconduct. there was a Lehman Brothers. The Lehman collapsed the exposed weaknesses in the risk management practices and the assessment of the counterparty risk. The companies must adopt a rigorous risk management framework and stress testing procedures to identify and mitigate the potential vulnerabilities. The ethical leadership and the culture. Enron culture of greed and unethical behavior, it permeated the organization from top to bottom. The ethical leadership is very essential for fostering a culture of integrity, honesty, accountability throughout the company. The WorldCom executives prioritize a short-term financial gain and long-term sustainability, leading to the unethical decision-making and the fraudulent practices. The companies must promote the ethical leadership and the value-driven culture to guide the decision-making and the behavior at all levels. The Lehman Brothers. The Lehman aggressive risk-taking culture and the focus on the short-term profits contributed to its downfall. The companies should prioritize the long-term value creation and consider the broader implication of their actions on a stakeholder and the society. The regulatory oversight and compliance. Enron collapse exposed the weaknesses in the financial reporting standards and the regulatory oversight. The regulators must implement and enforce the robust accounting rules, auditing standards, and the corporate governance requirements to safeguard the interest of the investors and the public policy. The WorldCom. The corporate governance failures, lesson learned from Enron, WorldCom, and the Lehman Brothers. The WorldCom scandal highlighted the deficiencies of the regulatory oversight and also the corporate governance practices. The regulators, they should enhance the oversight mechanisms and they conduct the regulatory audit and the regular audits and hold the executives accountable for the compliance and the legal and the ethical standards. The Lehman Brothers. Lehman collapse revealed the gaps in the regulatory oversight of the financial industry and the systematic risk. The regulators, they must monitor the systematic risk, enhance the transparency in the financial markets, and coordinate the efforts to prevent the future crisis. The regulators, they must monitor the systematic risk, enhance the transparency in the financial markets, and coordinate the efforts to prevent the future crisis. Stakeholder engagement and communication. We are now talking about the Enron. Enron failure to communicate the effectiveness with the stakeholders, including the employees, investors, regulators, it actually led to its downfall. The companies should prioritize open, transparent communications to build the trust and the credibility with the stakeholders. Now we talk about the WorldCom, the lessons learned. The WorldCom lack of transparency and disclosure, it eroded the investor confidence and the credibility. The companies should engage with the stakeholders proactively, provide accurate and timely information, and maintain the open channels of communication to address the concerns and build the trust. Now we talk about the Lehman Brothers. The Lehman failures to communicate its financial risk and exposure to investors and the regulators, it increased the market uncertainty and the panic. The companies should adopt a very clear and a consistent communication strategy to manage the risk, address the challenges, and maintain the stakeholder confidence during the time of crisis. So we can say, when you discuss about all the three cases and the lesson learned, the corporate governance failures of Enron, WorldCom, and the Lehman Brothers, it serves as a cautionary tale and provide a valuable insight into the importance of transparency, ethical leadership, regulatory oversight, stakeholder engagement in building a sustainable and the resilient business. The regulatory failures, that is, we are now discussing how the government oversight missed the signs as far as the regulatory failures are concerned. The regulatory failures surrounding the Enron, WorldCom and the Lehman brothers, as we have discussed, are indicative of systemic weaknesses in the government oversight mechanisms. So, here is now how the regulatory agencies missed these signs of the corporate misconduct and the financial instability. First, we will discuss about the Enron, that is a law oversight. The regulatory agencies, including the Security Exchange Commission (SEC), it failed to adequately scrutinize the Enron complex financial transactions and the off-balance sheet entities. Next is your regulatory capture. So, there were concerns about the close ties between the Enron executives and the government officials, leading to allegations of the regulatory capture and the undue influence over the regulatory decisions. We will now discuss about the WorldCom. That is, what was missed by the government as far as the WorldCom is concerned. There was inadequate oversight. Despite the warning signs and the whistleblower complaints, the regulatory agencies did not conduct thorough investigations into the WorldCom accounting practices until it was too late. The auditor failure. The role of the external auditor, such as the Arthur Andersen, came under scrutiny for failures to uncover the accounting irregularities and for their complicity in the fraud. Next, we will discuss about the Lehman brothers, that is what was missed by the government. The risk management oversight. The regulators did not adequately monitor the Lehman brothers' risk management practices or assess the firm's exposure to subprime mortgage assets and the other risky investments. The regulatory blind spots. The regulatory agencies, it underestimated the interconnectedness of the financial institutions and the systemic risk posed by the Lehman collapse, contributing to the severity of the financial crisis. Then we have important aspects and the common themes. The first and the foremost is your complexity. The complexity of the financial markets and the corporate structure, it posed the challenges for the regulators in understanding and monitoring the firm activities effectively and efficiently. Now is your resource constraint. The regulatory agencies faced the resource constraints, including the limited funding and the staffing, which hampered their ability to conduct a thorough examination and the investigations. Next we have as a revolving door. The revolving door between the regulatory agencies and the industries. They oversee the raised concerns about the conflict of interest and the regulatory capture of the regulators by the entities they regulate. What are the lessons learned? The first and the foremost is enhanced oversight. The regulatory agencies must bolster their oversight capabilities, including increased transparency, more rigorous examinations, and enhanced coordination amongst the regulatory bodies. Next we have is a strengthened enforcement. The regulators should prioritize the enforcement actions against such corporate wrongdoings, hold executives and the auditors accountable for the misconduct, and impose meaningful penalties to deter the future violations. Next we have is a regulatory reforms. The failures surrounding the Enron, WorldCom and the Lehman brothers, it underscored the need for regulatory reforms aimed at enhancing the transparency, accountability and the stability in the financial markets. The regulators' failures surrounding Enron, WorldCom and the Lehman brothers, it highlighted the challenges of overseeing the complex financial institutions and the importance of a robust regulatory framework. Effective enforcement mechanisms, vigilant oversight to safeguard the integrity and stability of the financial markets. So, let us see the ethical lapses. the culture and the corruption in the corporate America. The ethical lapses and instances of corruption in the corporate America have had far reaching consequences, eroding the trust in the business, damaging the reputations, and harming the stakeholders. So, here's a closer look at underlying factors contributing to these issues. The culture of the short termism. The first is your pressure for results. In many corporate environments, there is a relentless focus on the short term financial performance, leading to a pressure on the employees to meet the targets and deliver the immediate results. The next is your risk taking. This emphasis on the short term gains can actually incentivize the unethical behavior, such as cutting corners, misrepresenting financial results, or engaging in the fraudulent activities to meet quarterly the earning expectations. The lack of accountability, the top down influence. The ethical lapses often stem from top with the senior executive setting the tone for the organization. When the leaders prioritize the profits over the principles or turn a blind eye to a misconduct, it sends a message that unethical behavior is tolerated or even encouraged. The next is your weak oversight. In some cases, the board of directors and the regulators bodies, they fail to promote the effective oversight, allowing the unethical practices to go unchecked. So, without a robust accounting mechanism in place, there's a little incentive for the companies to uphold such ethical standards. Then there is a conflict of interest, that is the personal gain. Conflict of interest, where the personal interest conflicts with those of the company or its stakeholders, can lead to an unethical behavior. Executives may prioritize their own financial gain or the career advancement over the best interest of the company. The opaque relationships. The relationship between the companies, corporations, government officials, and other stakeholders can create opportunities for corruption. And when these relationships, they lack the transparency and accountability, they can actually fuel the unethical conduct such as the bribery, kickbacks, and the influence peddling. The toxic environment. We are now talking about the organization culture. That is the corporate lapses, culture and corruption in the corporate America. We will now be discussing about the organizational culture, that is the toxic environment. In some corporate cultures, the employees may feel the pressure to confront to the unethical norms or fear the retaliation for speaking out such misconduct. So, this creates a very toxic environment where unethical behavior can actually flourish. The lack of whistleblower protection. Without adequate protection for the whistleblowers who report a wrongdoing, employees may hesitate to come forward with the concerns, fearing the reprisal or the retaliation from the management. The rebuilding trust, that is the ethical leadership. Cultivating a culture of integrity starts with the ethical leadership at all levels of the organization. The leaders must lead by example, championing the ethical behavior and holding themselves and others accountable for upholding the ethical standards. The transparency and accountability. The companies should prioritize transparency in their operations, financial reporting, and decision making process. The robust accountability mechanisms, including the independent audits, oversight the committees, and the whistleblower protection, can help deter the unethical behavior and hold the wrongdoers accountable. Next is your stakeholder engagement. Engagement with the stakeholders, including the employees, customers, investors, and the communities, can really help build the trust and foster a culture of integrity. By actively listening to the stakeholders' concerns and addressing them transparently, the companies can actually demonstrate their commitment to the ethical behavior practices. Now, addressing the ethical lapses and the corruption in the corporate America, it requires a multifaceted approach encompassing the changes in the leadership, cultural governance, and the regulatory oversight. By prioritizing the ethics and the integrity, the companies can rebuild the trust, enhance their reputation, and create a sustainable value for all the stakeholders. So let's see the lessons learned, reforms and changes in the corporate practices. The corporate scandals, what we have discussed today, involving the Enron, WorldCom, and the Lehman brothers, they prompted some significant reforms and changes in the corporate practices aimed at preventing a similar ethical lapses and resorting a trust in the business community. So there are some lessons learned and the reforms implemented. The first is your strengthened corporate governance, that is the board independence. The reforms focused on enhancing the independence and effectiveness of the corporate boards. The companies were encouraged to appoint more independent directors with the diverse backgrounds and expertise to provide a stronger oversight and accountability. The first is your audit committees. The regulations required the companies to establish the independent audit committees composed of non-executive directors responsible for oversight, financial reporting and internal control and the audit process. The first is your enhanced financial reporting and transparency. We'll discuss about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act enacted in 2002. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act introduced the sweeping reforms to improve the corporate governance, financial reporting and the audit process. It mandated the stricter disclosure requirements, internal control and the oversight mechanisms. The CEO and CFO certifications. The CEO and CFO certifications are required to certify the accountancy and the accuracy and the completeness of the financial statements, increasing the accountability for the financial reporting accuracy. The next is your code of conduct. Many companies implemented or strengthened their code of conduct and the ethics policies, outlining the expected standards of behavior and the ethical principles for the employees, executives and the board members. The next is your whistleblower protection. The protection for the whistleblowers reporting corporate misconduct were enhanced to encourage the employees to speak up about the ethical violations without the fear of retaliation. The risk assessment. The companies begin to adopt more robust risk management framework to identify, assess and mitigate the risk effectively, including the financial, operational and the reputational risk. Next is your compliance program. The compliance functions were bolstered to ensure the adherence to the legal and the regulatory requirements, the ethical standards and the industry best practices. Next is your stakeholder engagement. The investor relations. The companies placed a greater emphasis on the transparency communication with investors, analytics and the other stakeholders, providing a more accurate and a timely information about the financial performance, strategy and the risk factors. The corporate social responsibility. Many firms embrace the CSR initiatives, recognizing the importance of the environmental, social and the governance considerations in building a sustainable business and maintaining the stakeholder trust. The regulatory oversight. So, the regulatory reforms strictly oversight and enforce the measures to prevent the corporate fraud, including the increased scrutiny of the financial institutions, auditing firms and the corporate executives. Next we talk about is a global coordination. The international regulatory bodies collaborated to develop the global standards and the best practices for the corporate governance, accounting and the financial regulation to address the cross-border challenges and the systematic risk. Then there is a continuous improvement adaptability. The companies recognize the need for a continuous improvement and adaptation to evolve the regulatory requirements, market dynamics and the stakeholder expectations. There has to be a culture of integrity. The culture of integrity and the ethical behavior becomes a strategic imperative for the companies, with a leadership commitment and employees' engagement driving the ethical decision making and accountability. So, we can say at the end, the reforms and the changes in the corporate practices following the Enron, WorldCom and the Lehman Brothers scandals represent a collective effort to strengthen the corporate governance, transparency and accountability, to rebuild the trust in the business community, promote a sustainable value creation for all the stakeholders. Thank you so much.